All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I think some other folks are still joining, but they can jump in as they arrive. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, The Remote World of Work and Organizational Compliance. My name is Adam Wright. I'm one of the vice presidents of legal product here at 650, and we're really excited to be hosting this webinar today along with Humoriso. We've got a great topic lined up for today, and I know it's an issue that is at the top of a lot of companies' minds right now as the way we work has changed so dramatically over the last few years. Just a few housekeeping matters before we get started. If you have questions, we would love for you to ask them. We would really like this to be as interactive as possible. So if you do have questions, we'd ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen as opposed to the chat. That just helps us monitor the questions a little better and make sure we get those answered. Also, for those of you that are seeking SHRM PDC, Professional Development Credit, we are going to be sending the slides, although we don't have too many slides. We'll be sending those along out via email after the webinar to the attendees, along with a certificate. So look for that afterwards. Before we get going, I just want to give you a little bit of background on 650 and Humoriso in case you're not familiar. 650 is a technology company headquartered in the Silicon Slopes of Utah, and we're dedicated to making the law more accessible to companies and individuals. We work with some of the smartest lawyers in the world to automate contracts, policies, and other legal paperwork that businesses and people need. As I'm sure you're well aware, the law is really complicated, and to comply with the law, companies need certain documents, have to say the right things. And if not, there can be some real consequences. And so what our software does is a process of compliance easy, and it helps users create documents, again, with some of the best lawyers in the nation behind those documents. This allows businesses of any size to afford the same quality legal documents as large companies that are paying lawyers a lot of money to create those same documents. Our system currently allows users to create over 200 different documents, and we're adding more documents to our system all the time. So if you want to know more about 650, you can visit our website at 650.com. Humoriso is a global human resources consulting firm that provides outsourced human resources services, including its flagship HRO plan, which helps businesses save money, increase productivity, and reduce legal risks by providing dedicated HR consulting for compliance, training, performance management, employee relations, workplace management, discipline, and other important HR best practices. And to learn more about Humoriso, you can visit their website at humoriso.com. So again, thanks so much for joining the webinar today. We're really excited about the topic, the remote world of work and organizational compliance. As we all know, as I already said, the way the world of work has shifted in the last 2 years has been dramatic, and it has really accelerated even the best of plans regarding implementing remote work and flexible staffing strategies. Just over 2 years ago, thought leaders in the workplace and human resources space were anticipating that work would become more mobile and flexible, but that was sort of not on the immediate horizon. It was maybe 10 years away. But as we all know, very quickly that was here, and companies had to pivot really quickly, whether they were ready or not. And I have been very surprised at how well companies have done given the circumstances, but it has not come without challenges. And today we're going to be chatting about some of the specific challenges that this new employment landscape poses for businesses. And I'm super excited to have two really great speakers joining us today who have put a ton of thought into this area, and that's John Baldino and Adrienne Jack. And I'll start with John. So John is the president of Humoriso. He has over 30 years of human resources experience, and his passion for setting contributors and companies up for success is still going strong. John, I think it's not an understatement or an overstatement to say that John is an HR superstar. He is a keynote speaker for US and international conferences where he shares content and thoughts on leadership, collaboration, and innovation, employee success, organizational design and development, as well as inclusion and diversity. He's the winner of the 2020 Greater Philadelphia HR Consultant of the Year Award. Most recently, John was selected as one of the top influencers in HR by the SHRM organization. And John is also the proud dad of 3 amazing young adults. And if you think with having 3 kids and such a successful career that John doesn't have time for fun, you would be wrong. He has been to at least 12 Billy Joel concerts, and I hear it might be as high as 17. and he's lost track. It's so many.
Right.
But he was also selected as a television host for a local Philly show, which after you hear John present will probably make sense why he was selected. So we're very excited to have John joining us today. Thanks so much for joining us, John.
Thanks, Adam.
Next, we have my colleague, Adrienne Jack. Adrienne is a vice president of legal product at 650 and works primarily on employment products, including return to work issues and employment handbooks and policies. Adrienne is really the primary architect of some of our most important tools at 650. She built our 50-state employment handbook tool and 50-state hiring kit, among others. She graduated from Northwestern Law and worked at a large international firm in DC for 5 years before returning to her home state of Utah and joining 650. Adrienne also makes time for fun, and
not as much fun.
I don't know. I think it's debatable. When she's not diving into the intricacies of the law, she enjoys listening to Taylor Swift, spending time with her 5 kids, wearing warm socks, and eating street tacos. So we're really excited to have Adrienne here today.
Thanks, Adam.
So again, we have a lot of interesting topics to cover in our conversation today. We're going to be talking about company culture, equity in the workplace, policies and best practices, and hiring issues related to remote and dispersed workforces. So let's just jump right in. I think, as companies move toward a more flexible and remote workplace, one challenge is maintaining company culture, or for new companies that are starting as a remote or hybrid workplace, the challenge is to develop that company culture that they want in the first place. So I'll start with a question to John. So John, how do companies build and preserve their culture with a dispersed workforce? And what are some of the considerations that companies need to be thinking through?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with an easy one. So the considerations, right, really vary. The one thing that I would probably say to start with, even just in the question itself, is the culture worth preserving, right? Like, it may be that you're realizing what you've been about as an organization needs to end, right? Parts of it has to stop. The culture was kind of toxic, or it was overbearing. Or people were treated as commodities, right, rather than contributors. Those kinds of things, I think, are worth sitting back first as you try to dissect how do we build forward with this hybrid, remote, mixed geography workforce. Because you may be surprised to say, yeah, we need to start from scratch in a couple of these areas, right? Because it's kind of like time to sort of be honest with yourself about what your culture has been like.
And do companies, I'm curious, do you see companies that are grappling with that sort of sitting down and making a specific definition of what their company culture is and what they want it to be? Or is it this sort of nebulous thing in the air that you just hope you create? What do you see companies doing, and what do you think is the best practice there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very wise way to put that. I would say that what we see often is there's an idealistic, right? So many organizations will have a values system. There's phrases or words that are used to say, hey, these are our company values. What often isn't given enough thought or time is, how do they show up in our work, right? So to your question, there are some companies that have now sat down with their values and said, is this honest? Number one, are we really about these things? Because how do we instill this in people who are elsewhere? Because we're going to struggle to tell them that we have an open door policy and I've never met you in person. The door is now Zoom, and it doesn't feel as authentic. And so we want it to be more authentic. So they kind of wrestle with, well, what does open door really mean? I'm just using it as an example, right? So what does it mean? Maybe it means that we operate out of integrity, or there's a willingness to communicate, or equity in idea and innovation. Get to the heart of what that means, because sometimes those things just become like catchphrases. We have an
Right.
open door organization. Well, I may want to close my door sometimes with some
Right.
of the people here.
Yeah.
Now what? Now what?
Yeah. Yeah.
John, I'm
right.
so glad. Adam, can I jump in?
Sure,
I love
please.
John's perspective because we come at this from different angles. John has the HR expertise and I come at it from a legal lens. And so we're looking at kind of different issues in different ways, which is, I think, really interesting. And, you know, we think a lot about legal implication and risk. Those are always things top of mind for lawyers. But then when it comes to, you know, how do those affect culture and values? I think that's a totally different conversation. And the values are, which I'm learning a lot about and a lot from John, is how the values differ from the culture, where a company might have core values, but then how does that exhibit itself in company policies? How are those exhibited in employee behaviors and interaction and even processes at the company? And that's kind of the manifestation of the values in the culture, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and you see this as a problem in like performance management. Right. So we want people to know kind of how they're doing and where they stand. And Adrienne, to your point, like there's a process to that, and that's healthy, right? Because it creates equity in a process, and we appreciate that. But we don't, there are too many organizations that don't use their values as a marker within their performance management. And so then people are like, well, what difference does that make? Because nobody asks me about it. You only ask me about my numbers or my productivity or whatever. And nobody ever asks me about collaboration, right? Or innovate. Nobody's asking me about that. So how is that a value if we never talk about it?
Yeah, I think those are both really interesting points. And, you know, we'll talk about specific policies and practices later, but as it relates to culture, you know, I'll start with Adrienne. I'm curious on both of your thoughts here, though. Are there specific policies that employers can have in place that help promote the company culture that they're aiming for?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, just having a policy on certain issues can reflect culture. So for example, smaller companies might decide, okay, should we have a video conferencing policy for employees, or should we defer to their judgment and say, you know, we're professionals, you know, we trust your judgment. So I think even the preliminary step of should there be a policy is really a cultural assessment in some ways of how would this impact our culture? Will it be overbearing if we have a policy on this? Or, you know, is it a best practice because really our brand is, you know, is key, and we really want to protect our brand through these policies that will help us. So I think the first question is, should there even be a policy, which comes from a lot of different angles of the culture, of what are the laws that are involved, what are the different considerations from company size. Is this something that we're actually going to follow? And how are we actually going to enforce this policy, or will we enforce it? So I think those are some preliminary issues of, okay, should we have a policy? And then kind of what kind of policy or approach should we take? Should it be a very kind of high level policy? Should it be pretty granular and detailed? So I think once the company thinks about those types of issues, you know, there are, I think in every policy, you're seeing a company culture. You're seeing not only like the law and the protocols and the policy and the underlying issues that a company is trying to address, but how they're addressed, how the company speaks, that all affects that. Culture is a part of all of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Adrienne, it's interesting because when you look to develop these policies, there are organizations that will go very granular in their policies, like super granular. And even though a business leader might think, good for us for being that granular, because we really want our employees to understand where the road is. And so that's why we've been that specific. But in other ways, what you also are communicating in so many granular policies could be micromanagement. And so now micromanagement becomes the unspoken value of the culture, right? Because it's like, well, I see what you have on the wall or what you sent me via email is what the values are. But what I'm seeing is micromanagement, distrust, right? Sort of this big brother mentality, because you've got every little thing. You tell me how to get on Zoom, what button to click. You have 4 backgrounds to choose from. You've got this, you've got that. Like, and it's like, oh my goodness, I'm a person who has worked the last 10 years in other places. Like, give me a break. But then I want to make sure I say too, I also know that I know we're going to talk more about this, but for the very first time, some organizations are hiring from well outside of the geography that they're used to. And so you don't always know what professional means. Adrienne, you had mentioned that. Like, what does that mean in Miami versus, Sheboygan? They may be very different. I just like saying Sheboygan.
Is it because you like Home Alone, John? Just tell me.
It's like you don't use that enough in sentences. So whenever I can, I just want to throw it in. But like, if you've ever been to Miami Beach, it's a different professional vibe if you're working there than somewhere else in the Midwest or Northwest, or it's just different. And so you might need to be a little bit more explanatory in policy so that people understand how far is too far, right?
Well, and John, as a lawyer, I love long, comprehensive, robust policies. So I am your nightmare. So lawyers love, right? We want belt and suspenders. We want to outline every protocol, the consequences for violating it, but we want everything there. And I think there's a balance, right? Because that can be very overbearing and micromanaging, but also sometimes in certain situations, it's very important to the company, right? And it protects their proprietary information, their confidential information, their company property. I think sometimes it's necessary. I think lawyers take it too far sometimes, but I think there's a balance of knowing when it's necessary to be granular and specific. And then I think when it is a very intense policy like that, it's helpful to communicate to employees why. Why do we have this really long, comprehensive policy that seems to micromanage? And if the company can communicate that, it's because confidential information is the success of our business. We have to protect that. That's our core. And so I think if the company communicates that, that can help alleviate kind of the overbearing weight of the policy that employees might see as, why am I being micromanaged? It's because this, if the communication is there, I think it can help it kind of smooth that transition to employees being able to digest the policy.
And I also think on top of that, being not only if it's overly granular, is it feeling overbearing potentially to the employees, but it also creates real challenges for the company, right? Like if you use John's example, if this is how you get on Zoom, this is the button you push, and these are all the steps, how do you enforce that meaningfully, right? And how do you do that equitably across your workforce? It seems like a total nightmare, which is another reason I think it's probably a good idea, to Adrienne's point, to if you have a very granular specific purpose or policy, know what the purpose is of that and explain that to your employees.
Yes, totally.
So I think these examples of positive steps, to take to create company culture are very helpful. For me, I know I always like hearing what not to do also. So John, I'm curious, do you have some top points on what not to do to create sort of the company culture that you're going for?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing actually some of that right now, right? So the what not to do is the residue that some organizations that were very proximity oriented are struggling with. So what do I mean by that? Ping pong tables, beer meisters, air hockey, all that kind of stuff that we had in these break rooms that are now like, half empty.
Are you still riding your Segway around the office, John?
Totally. It's much better because nobody's here. So I get where I got to go much quicker. Yeah, like that's so funny you said that. Like literally, I've been involved at organizations where I walk in and there are roadways painted on the concrete floors, traffic lights, the whole nine. Okay, well now it seems crazy. It seems silly. You're walking around like, we paid for all this and now almost no one is here, or they're only here 1 or 2 days a week. Or so if you built your organization by proximity when it comes to culture, you may be struggling now because talent is coming at a premium. We don't have enough people. And so organizations have had to push those geographic boundaries to find talent to fill the roles that they have open. Well, now, Jimmy in Lincoln, Nebraska is never going to ride his Segway in your New York City location. It's never going to happen. So what do we do now? How do we help Jimmy to feel culturally connected to everybody else? That's when I think you have to go back to your policy and say, let's even look at the tone that some of this policy was written. Was it written, I'm going to use the word chummy, right? Was it written like, yo, we know how to treat one another, just sit down with one another and grab a coffee and look, that's right from a communication in general perspective, but not specifically. So go back through and look at those policies to say, what does it mean to really break bread with somebody now that you've never met in person?
Yeah.
That you don't know what kind of food they like. You didn't observe the fact that they go and get this kind of food every Thursday. You know, you don't pick up on those natural cues that being in proximity with someone will give you. We've got to rethink how we build that rapport and develop rapport with one another, because it is culturally relevant and it's going to influence the way policy is written.
Yeah. And, I have personal experience with this. I've been at 650 now for almost a year. And just this week, I met most of my colleagues for the first time in person.
Yeah.
But, that being said, I'd never worked remotely before, but I was so surprised at how quickly I felt like a real part of the team and the culture. And I knew what the culture of the company was. Yeah. And so, Adrienne, I'm curious, like, what do you think that 650's done to help with that? How was I able to feel that connected to the team without, being in proximity? So.
Yeah, I met Adam for the first time this week, so I can confirm he is a real person. That was great. After working together for a year, it was nice to finally meet in person. But I think our company handles it different than other companies, right? So our approach might not fit other companies, but I think 650's culture is very work hard, play hard. So we like to crack jokes and have fun, but we also like to work hard and get things done. And we also like to celebrate each other a lot. So whenever somebody does something fantastic, we love to call that out. And that's great because that's something that you can do on hybrid platforms or remote platforms versus having to be in the office to really celebrate somebody. So if somebody on a different team does something awesome, we shout that out, and we use Slack at our company, but on those virtual communication platforms, I think it helps kind of unify companies and teams specifically by being able to celebrate each other's successes. And we also have a water cooler chat every day where we get on a call each day for 30 minutes and we talk about what shows people are watching, how they feel about current events. Are they team Johnny or team Amber? I mean, we talk about different experiences people are having, never work related, just what people are doing. And that I think helps build culture as well and kind of build those bonds that we have with each other. But I think that sometimes I've heard companies that kind of take this kind of remote team building, it seems they take it so far that it's almost kind of exhausting for employees to to have to jump on another Zoom call, which is kind of the nightmare for a lot of people. Is now I have to get on a Zoom cocktail hour. That sounds like a nightmare, right? For a lot of people. And so I think there's a balance of when is it helpful and when is it actually not, and being able to kind of strike that balance is tricky. And I'd love to hear John's thoughts on what he's seen people do.
Well, I was going to say, I think those are fantastic points. I would say, according to the internet, there's only one team, I think, to be on in the Team Johnny, Team Amber thing. So I'm not sure what it is you're talking about. But I would say though that one of the points that you mentioned in terms of meeting each other for the first time this past week at 650, there's something to be said that is true pre-COVID and is still true now, whether it's a remote workforce, hybrid, or there is something to be said about learning and knowing your audience. If it is natural for us to have to build a relationship with someone that's new, that is new to us, that we have to work with. Even if Adam had started a year ago in person with people at 650, day one, you may not be cracking some of the same jokes with him as you are now a year later, right? There has to be some time. There has to be some understanding. Certainly, I appreciate and understand that there's boundaries around jokes and those kinds of things as well. I think we all do. I mean, my goodness, there's lawyers all around me right now. So I know we all know this, right? But the idea of thinking that we all of a sudden have to short circuit that because we're doing this, oh no, we got to hurry up and build that rapport and relationship. And so let's get right to this sort of uber comfortable level that the person on the receiving end might feel, oh my gosh, this is not the kind of engagement that I want. I don't even know who you are, right? So you have to be thoughtful about that because it really can short circuit sort of an equitable approach to the way in which rapport development is done. It makes it very top heavy, and it also can create an us and them environment. The us perhaps being the people who tend to see each other more in person because they can be hybrid or are working together in a physical location, and the people who have to operate only remotely always feel like they're the second-class citizens. That's a really poor setup for long-term cultural development.
Yeah. And I think, it's important to think about, we have all these best practices, right? That companies, their C-suite team can sit down and think about, okay, this is how we want to, make sure our remote workers feel a part of the team and involved. And then it's another question as to whether what they've decided is actually working, right? And so figuring that out seems to be a real challenge. And, obviously employee morale is a really important aspect of a business's success. And so, in this hybrid remote landscape, how can companies judge whether what they're implementing is actually achieving their goals, or whether, there is positive employee morale in their company?
I mean, Adrienne, hopefully this meets legal compliance, but go out on a limb and say, ask them. How about it, right? Ask them. Yes, you can put together surveys. I'm not poo-pooing that, and send them out and have everybody, fill in stuff. Great. If you want something documented, it's wonderful, fantastic. But you can also do it in a much more, I would say, genuine way, particularly if you're trying to be thoughtful about your culture. Just talk to people. Schedule, and let me also provide some freedom for people too. Not every meeting has to be an hour.
What?
You can end early.
Hot take.
Right? Like, you can do a 10-minute, 7-minute check-in with somebody that's hyper-focused around how are you doing and how are you feeling connected. That's it. That's all it has to be in it. And walk away from there and having a lot more information than you did 5 or 7 minutes earlier, whatever it might be, without it having to be, let's sit and look at each other for an hour so that I can go through this list that my loving HR department gave me of 17 questions, 3 of them with 4 subpoints. That's not what you want to do. It shouldn't be a burden. Talk to people.
Yeah. Well, and John, I think too, gathering information is difficult, right? Because if it is very helpful. I think talking to people is the answer, but I think making sure that they're comfortable giving candid feedback. And sometimes they're not comfortable giving that one-on-one without anonymity, right? They want to be able to provide that in an anonymous way to say, look, like, I don't want to bring this up and ruffle feathers or be the subject of retaliation or informal or not, but I want to just be able to put this issue out there without it being tied to me. And I think that sometimes more anonymous methods are helpful with that. But I do think when it comes to surveys and kind of opening that feedback from employees, I think attorneys are very averse to that, right? There are legal risks with opening the box to say, employees, tell us anything, what's going on? Because, ideally the company culture is great and great things are happening, but what if they're not? What if there's something that's a harassment or discrimination or unlawful things, or even violations of company policies that are going on that are then exposed with this information gathering, which the company should want to know that. But then I think companies have to be ready to think, okay, if we're going to open this box to get feedback, how are we going to address it? And if there is something going on that's unlawful or just against company policies, how are we going to immediately take action on that? Because I think one of the worst outcomes is saying, oh, we want to hear your experiences. We want to know what's going on. And employees then put themselves out there to give that. And the company doesn't act on something that's going on that needs to be stopped, or they just dismiss negative feedback, which, really brings down the culture and the morale from gathering it and then not acting on it.
For sure. And I think, of course, there are the extreme examples that you bring up around harassment or discrimination or legal lawful considerations, of course. But I think you bring up even I would say a wider sweeping consideration, which is does your organization operate as a safe space? If everything has to be done by anonymity because we know we're not going to get honest answers unless all of our team feels like they can do it under the cloud of night, I want to submit to you, something's wrong. something is wrong, because where I get to sit as president of Humoriso, and I'm grateful, so grateful for the role that I have, but anyone at any level, 4 levels down from where I sit on the org chart can grab a Zoom chat with me wherever they are and say, hey, I just want to talk to you for a minute. This is not working. And for them to know about me, that I'm going to go, tell me more. Tell me where's that perspective coming from? Because I'm seeking to understand. If the tone isn't being set at those senior levels, it is not going to be a surprise that people don't feel safe, Adrienne, to your point, in coming to, they're just not going to do it.
And how do you know? I mean, how do you, as a company, say, are we safe? Are we a safe space? How do you gauge where you are on that?
I think part of it has to do with some of what you just said, meaning, do we really only get the best feedback through our anonymous surveys? That's definitely an indicator. I'd also look online. Facebook is a minefield of your employees saying terrible things, Glassdoor, those kinds of things. If that's where it's happening mostly, I'm not asking you to stalk people, but I am saying if that's coming back to you, people talk. You're going to have somebody eventually come in your office and say, hey, remember Joe and Mike and Susan that used to work here? Woo! They started this Facebook group of, disgruntled people from Humoriso, and they've opened it up for current employees, and you should see what's being said there. I'm not as mad about, let me get on Facebook and see what these people are writing, as much as I'm disheartened to say, holy crap, what kind of organization have we put together where that's where people have to go, knowing that there'll be no resolution in Facebook. Let me make sure I put that out there to everybody as well. Facebook will not solve your problems.
Another hot take, John.
It's not. But we know there's a lot of that goes on that's never going to make its way into the company to create real change. If that's going on, that's another indicator that we got to change the way that we're operating with one another.
Yeah. Well, I think we could talk about culture all day, and our next topic is sort of equity when it comes to remote work and hybrid workplaces, and the unique challenges that presents. And I think it's hard to disentangle culture from DEI a lot of the time. And so I think a lot of what we just talked about really overlaps with equity. But I know this is an area that both Adrienne and John are passionate about and have thought a lot about. But to set the stage, I'll just ask Adrienne a question. When we're talking about equity when it comes to a hybrid or remote workforce, how are we defining that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, this type of equity is different. We use equity in a lot of ways. That's a versatile term. But this particular type of equity, I think we wanted to focus on the equity between remote workers or hybrid workers or on-site employees. So that's kind of the particular focus that we have. And I think when we're looking at that kind of equity, it's really about kind of 3 factors: is, do these people all have the ability are they all represented in an equitable way? Are they all in the same spaces? Do they all have the same ability to be equitably represented? And second, do they all have equitable participation? So that means not just invited to the meeting, but our remote and hybrid workers, do they have the same ability to participate as hosts, or to present meetings as those who are on site? And also, does everyone have the same access to information? Do they all have equitable access to information? So as far as remote and and on-site employees, we think of it as that. First, are they all represented equitably? Do they all have the participation equitably? And is their information similar? Or do on-site people have a particular priority to information? Or is it really distributed equitably? Or do they hear it secondhand from those who are maybe going in the office and hear something here and there? So I think that's kind of the factors that I think about when I think about equity in this way.
Yeah,
and go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say, I think that if I can just unpack one piece, because I think that I want, for our audience sake, for there to be a bit of a comparison. And I think that Adrienne described super well, right, the considerations that we have to have. And I want to submit that there's a difference between providing things equitably and equally. And we have to know that there's a difference between the two, right? So you might equally disseminate information, but it may not happen equitably. So if those people on site right, who are physically present for whatever reason, Adrienne, to use that example you brought up, for whatever that info might be, get a little bit more. It's unpacked a little differently. They have a bit of back and forth with some people there about the information that's been given. And that conversation, that engagement, that back and forth never makes its way to everybody else who say is working remotely. And the argument is, well, we sent the same stuff to you. You know, yeah, but I now did not get to participate in sort of the nuanced understanding of what you sent out. Did you distribute things equally? Yes. Is everyone being treated equitably with that information? No.
That's a great point. I mean, I think I've seen companies kind of tackle this in different ways of how do we really get that equity between remote and on-site employees. And I think, you know, I've seen different examples that may or may not be working, but I saw one company that if any employee is on a meeting remotely, requires everyone to join via video conference instead of everyone being in the office on the video conference and then one person on the screen, because that might not be equitable representation, right? If everyone's sitting together and then there's a small screen with somebody who's joining remotely, is that really equitable? It might be, it might not be. Is this a great policy? I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying here's how different companies tackle this issue. And I like somebody mentioned in the chat, I think Greg in our chat said that sometimes remote people are seen as less committed than those who go into the office. So there's kind of something there to balance, and that needs to be tackled and addressed within a companies to make sure that there's, you know, that's been equitable as well.
Yeah.
What about in terms of training, right? So, you know, potentially on-site employees are going to have access to types and potentially quality of training that remote workers aren't going to have, right? They're going to have in-person training. They're going to be able to interact with supervisors or managers one-on-one. How have y'all seen companies deal with that?
I mean, if they get to talk to me, they'll be disappointed that they are, because often one of the first things that I'll say is, why are we having this discussion? Why are you asking because you're looking for a way out to make it less than for somebody? You're asking the question from a negative disposition. I have seen organizations have to own the fact that, hi, you got rid of 66% of your office space. You're saving some money in the rent that you used to pay. How about you pay for a couple of people who are remote to fly in and be a part of the training in person? Put them up at a hotel for a couple of nights, let them meet some people. If your scales are tilted for a particular training where there's more people that will be physically together than not, bring those people in. Oh, John, that's expensive. Is it more expensive than the monthly rent you were paying previously? Tell me that it is. And by the way, I won't believe you unless I see numbers from your finance officer, right? Because I know you're going to lie. You rented office space in Manhattan. Don't tell me it's going to be more expensive to fly these people in. The idea of trying to create experience actually makes the training richer. It sticks deeper. It's a shared experience that then when those individuals who do work remotely fly home, they will get on the next video calls differently. They're going to talk to Adam and Adrienne differently because we just had this shared experience together. Real quick, case in point, I have a couple of people who are in the Vero Beach office this week who one works 100% remotely, and the other typically works out of a regional office outside of Philadelphia. They've never been together before. They're sitting in the same area together, chatting, doing work, like enjoying each other's company. When they're done here this week, their relationship has gone to a better spot. And so when they share experiences, when we can't fly everywhere together, and I know that it can't happen every time, they're going to approach the training together or the session together or the collaboration together differently.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and something I can certainly attest to after meeting a lot of my colleagues for the first time this week. So let's transition and talk a little bit about policies and practices. And again, these are all topics that sort of are fluid and relate to each other, which I think is interesting. But as we've talked about, a company's policies and practices play a real important role in developing and maintaining company culture, as well as encouraging a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. But often a company's policies and practices don't align. And so, John, I'm curious to hear from you. How are you seeing companies' policies and practices diverge, and is that a problem all the time, or is that necessary sometimes?
Well, certainly I'd have to say it could be necessary sometimes. Could be, but by and large, I think that you brought up a great point, Adam, earlier, which was about like the Zoom example. What is the enforcement of this policy going to be like? So before we sit and start to decide these are our policies, think it all the way through, not just the construct or why we have to have it. How will it be enforced? To whom will that fall? And if people, organizations like to say, well, a manager will take care of it. Has that manager been coached about how to address that? I don't know what is wrong with us. I mean, after all these years, we still think that once I dub you manager, you have become endowed with some special skill set from the heavens that just was imparted to you all of a sudden because of this promotion. It's the craziest thing, right? Like, I don't understand, but we continue to operate that way. We really do. And then, and the person who's been put in that manager spot, let me make sure I say this, they're going to be nervous to come to you and say, I'm so sorry. No one taught me this. How do I, and now they're going to worry that, oh, you're going to think you made a mistake making me a manager. You might take this away now. So I don't want to be the person who's going to come. And so all of a sudden, policy becomes the unspoken issue between managers and senior directors and managers and employees, because everyone's sort of like dancing around. I think I'm handling this right. Nobody wants to tell me. I'm not asking. And policy becomes very, very much categorized in a way that it never was meant to. It's supposed to just be a piece of how we exist and who we are, and it's okay, and we're going to flow with this. It all of a sudden becomes a bargaining chip, and that's not the way it was set up to be.
Yeah, I think that's so important, John, that companies can kind of mitigate this problem a little bit by training supervisors and managers just out of the gate. Here, periodically, doesn't matter how long you've been there, anything like that, but just here are some of our policies. Here's how we expect them to be followed. And here's what to do if they're not being followed in the way that we're hoping. And I think getting that out of the gate can really help with the enforcement of policies that can be problematic down the road, but giving them specific examples, especially if companies are revamping their policies as a result of hybrid and remote working, that's a great time to say, we've refreshed our policies. We want to just sync up with everybody and present those to employees, but also on the back end, train supervisors and managers on what they mean and how to go forward.
And it's interesting, Adrienne, and I actually don't know that I realized this about you until the beginning of this time today, which is that you have 5 kids. I have 3. I don't know that I knew you had 5, which that's how many I wanted, and so my wife thought differently. And so but what I think is curious from a parental perspective when it comes to this is there are ways in which those who have experienced children, we put rules into place. Like, we have boundary for kids. We do it in schools. We do it in various places where we want those that we're helping to form, right? Helping them to think better, that we say this far is too far. Here's the boundary. And that's really what policy ought to be about. This far is too far. And what is fascinating to me is when we get to the adult level in the workplace and you hear people say, I don't want to be told what to do, or you think this, right? You presume people don't want to be told what to do, and they're adults and you should treat them like adults. Yes, you should treat them like adults, but I want to make sure you understand, we enjoy boundary. We do like to know how far is too far, right? It's in our makeup. We grow up this way. So it shouldn't stress you out that you have to have some things that there's going to be bumpers to, like in a bowling alley. Like this is going to get you in the gutter. So we'll put these things here so you don't go into the gutter.
Yeah. And unfortunately, when you become a parent, I didn't realize there was no just magical power that gave you greater judgment. I mean, why isn't there a parent boot camp for this?
Well, just like I was saying a few minutes ago, if you just kind of promote all your kids to managers, then they get endowed with all of these, smart skills now. So just
that's okay. Good pro tip. Thank you for another pro tip.
Adrienne, I'm curious, do you have, what are your thoughts on sort of best practices in drafting policies for a remote or hybrid workforce? Are there specific policies that companies should be thinking about that they need to have in place, and how should they be going about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are policies that companies have had in place prior to any, if they didn't have remote workers 2 years ago, but, company confidential information, how to use company property, appropriate use of social media. I mean, those are things that companies might have had policies about, but they really need to reevaluate as a result of what hybrid and remote working look like now. Is it really realistic to say at no point in your home during a workday can you look at social media, or does that happen during, work breaks? How does that look in reality? And do those policies, because if you have an unrealistic policy or a policy that you don't even expect to enforce, I mean, that's problematic for employees, because then that kind of discredits the whole policy. So while you might have some important information in there, if you have information in there that really doesn't reflect how you operate or anything that you ever expect to enforce, I think that can be damaging to a policy. So I think there are some new policies we've seen recently as a result of hybrid working, like video conferencing policies that we didn't have 2 years ago, or desk hoteling policies that companies are now implementing. There are new policies to think about, but I think most of the work needs to be done on refreshing current policies or policies that have been around that companies know about, but how are they working? Do they really reflect the current working environment? I think is a big step to kind of getting a compliant policies and handbook in place.
Yeah. And I think there's a way to look at things right now that ought to be happening, that it's no longer reactive, but proactive. And what I mean by that is, when the pandemic first started in, March of 2020, so many locations, mandates were put into place, people were sent home, all of that, we were operating reactively. The world was, right? We didn't know what to do, how to do it. And so you may have had a very sort of janky set of policies happening because every week things change, new regulations. That's okay. First of all, let's make sure we all understand that everybody had to. We didn't know what we were doing. We still, in some ways, don't for everything, but we really didn't know what we were doing. Everything's new. Here we are all this time later. It requires you to be much more thoughtful and proactive about how you're going to approach this, right? It is not the as I said, the us and them. And in HR, I have to say, I see this too often, which is, the better job is when you're remote, and the worst job is when you have to go in. We want to lobby for everyone to be remote. That's unrealistic, and it's not true. Some of these HR people are the same people who go to a restaurant after work or go to the bar and get a drink. Well, you want somebody to Zoom your drink for you? Did you ever have a Zoom martini before? It doesn't taste so good, right? Like, so you have to have people who are going to be physically at work. So be very thoughtful about how you create policy, that you aren't creating a caste system in the course of doing that. And that's very much going to influence the way not only employees choose to stay at your organization from a retention consideration, but how they'll promote through the organization, and quite frankly, how people may choose to come into your organization as well. That's a
great point. One, I think, new issue that employers are having to deal with is hiring employees and all across the country, right? They now may be operating in states that they never would have imagined they're operating in. And so, I think more than ever, companies need to know where their employees are located. And that, obviously, in the past, you knew where they were, right? They were coming into your office every day, so they were somewhere close by. But in terms of keeping track of where your workforce is located, Adrienne, are there certain policies that you're seeing companies put into place to help with that?
I mean, remote working policies and relocation policies are not new, but I think employees really need to understand, why do we have a relocation policy and why does that matter to the company? And I think that's huge, because if an employee thinks, oh, I work completely remotely, might as well pick up from Utah and move to Montana because I like it there and it's beautiful. But that has major implications for the company if they don't have employees in Montana already and they're not used to doing business there or having employees in that state. And so I think communicating to employees, look, we have these policies because we need to know where you are, because that has employment and business and tax implications to our business that we have to be able to plan in advance. And we've seen companies where employees moved remotely because they didn't think it mattered to their employer, and that the employer is not in a position to do business in that state. And they've had to let employees go because they didn't know the employee moved there and the employee did it without any notice or permission. And so I think communicating to employees is, look, it's not that we're trying to micromanage your life and your personal decisions, but we need to know because that has business implications to us. And there's, like a high level, here's kind of what they are, I think is really helpful to employees, and kind of building up that relocation policy so it's clear to employees and also they understand the impact.
Yeah, and obviously there's so much, so many benefits to companies for being able to hire remotely now, right? You have an expanded talent pool and labor market, and that's especially important now when we have such a tight labor market. But those upsides obviously aren't without their challenges, as Adrienne just attests to. And Adrienne, I'll ask you one more question that I know we get a lot, which is that, well, even if I only have one employee in California, and all my other employees are in Texas, do I really have to comply with California law?
Right? Yes. I mean, the answer is yes. And we hear so many, but what if they only work with our customers in Texas? What if they come to our Texas office once a month? The answer is no. Wherever the employee lives is generally the law that's going to govern that employment relationship. So it matters where they live. It matters a lot. And it doesn't matter if it's a one-off employee or, it can be even for a short period of time. I mean, some states have laws about how long the employee has to live there before certain employment or tax implications are met. But in a lot of states, it's day one. When an employee permanently moves to a new location, day one, the company needs to have certain things in place to legally operate.
John, I take it that you're seeing this a lot too.
Oh my gosh, like it's just, and I think a couple of the other areas as well are things like payroll, right? And so someone saying we don't want to have to file in such and such a state, as a company. Okay, this isn't about, to Adrienne, to your example a couple minutes ago, like it's not that a current employee moved and then let us know after the fact. You are now recruiting nationally, or at least more regionally, and you're hiring people in states you've never hired people in before, and they're not coming into your workplace. That was different, right? They used to come across the river and come into our office. Okay, but that was different. They're not coming to your office. They're working for their situs, where they're working from is their home. So you have to do your payroll taxes there. That's their problem. When they file their taxes, no, that's not true, right? And so you can't just take all your tax advice from Google. You can't just decide that this is how I want it to be. There's so many of those considerations, and quite frankly, let me just say this: it's not as bad as you think. Filing for taxes in other states is not as bad as you think, and so don't exasperate it. So that if I just hired Adrienne and she's in Utah and it's my first Utah employee, well, Adrienne, we're excited to have you, but I got to set the whole tax thing up now and all. So you just got to give me a minute. Like, my attitude, my verbiage is letting her know you're already a problem as you start with us. That's definitely not the way you want to start a relationship, an employer-employee relationship. It shouldn't be true to the culture, you're putting together. Know what you need to do ahead of time, right? Plan ahead of time.
I think those are great points, and we're running up close to the hour now. And I will say, Adrienne and I do a lot of webinars that are very slide intensive, lots of information, and it has been very refreshing to have a conversation with John and Adrienne. And this format's been really nice. That said, we do have one slide for you, which we'll put up now, and it sort of just summarizes some of our key takeaways. from today's discussion. And I'll let John and Adrienne take it away if you have any final points you want to make on any of these takeaways.
Adrienne, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think just in general, we kind of ran through a lot of different issues, and there could be more said on so many of these issues, but I think it comes down to thinking about company culture. What does it look like? What do you want it to look like? And how do you course correct if it's off course? And then closely followed with culture is, how does that affect equity between remote, on-site, and hybrid employees? What does that look like? Is your culture being equitable to those people? Are your policies being equitable to all of those groups of people? And then keeping those policies current that reflect current company practices so that employees can be happy and they can have that as a resource rather than kind of a stumbling block or point of confusion. And then hiring across 50 states. It's complicated. Companies need a plan in advance and then be able to kind of be nimble and know kind of what their limits are of what's their bandwidth with hiring employees in different states, how much, what states are okay, what states are not, and then really kind of plan that in advance before they run into those issues.
I would say, I'd say in conjunction with those thoughts, one of the things that I also saw in the chat, and I want to make sure I highlight too, is the conversation that we had today is a starting point. And so there's a lot more to unpack with these areas. And certainly we're not saying that the employer is the parent in the relationship with an employee, right? I think what we were talking about in that kind of consideration is just the construct of boundary. And so it is, don't fear the fact that there may need to be policy and procedures put into place for the equitable opportunity for all, right? That has to be something that we think through. And that continuity is actually comforting to most. And so when employees are comforted by something like that, that's a retention tool. They see themselves as having a voice and a place and an opportunity where they are. And policy can be a tool towards that, right? And I hope that's what some people have been able to hear from us today as we walk through this.
As John said, there's a lot more here to unpack, and lucky for everyone on this call, we have an upcoming opportunity where more of this will be unpacked. If we can go to the next slide. It's a quick plug for an upcoming event. So if you'd like to keep this conversation going, you can join us at the SHRM conference in New Orleans coming up on June 13th. You can join us at 650's booth from 2:30 to 3:30. John will be there to answer all your questions that didn't get answered today, and again, to continue this conversation. And if that's not enough, which it should be because John's amazing, we have Starbucks gift cards as well. So with that said, I think this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. And obviously a big thanks to John and Adrienne for taking the time to prepare and talk through these issues that are really complicated and that a lot of companies are grappling with. So we hope it was informative, and thanks again for joining, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.